James Workshop doesn't want you to know this, but there's actually 3 extra Plague Marines in this box. Okay, maybe that's the worst kept secret in the entire Death Guard fanbase, but every now and then I still see Reddit posts asking about this weird half of a Plague Marine that appears on every Poxwalker sprue. And I don't know about you, but I am all about getting as much use out of my plastic as I possibly can. But since this guy's extra and I don't need him for a Plague Marine squad, I want to do something a little bit extra that fits my Nurgle warband theme. So if mosquitoes, ticks, and other blood-sucking insects are a direction that you might want to go with your Death Guard army, stick around. My name's Colt, this is Gone Hollow Minis, and today we're converting some blood-sucking Plague Marines. The lore for my Death Guard army is that they're not actually from the 14th Legion. Instead, they were once a Blood Angel successor chapter that was lost in the warp, each battle brother falling to the Black Rage as their lost battle barge was assailed by Khorne. Until, finally, the chapter's sanguinary priest was offered a way to cure the rage, the Black Chalice. Of course, things didn't go exactly to plan. The chalice was actually given by Nurgle in a ploy to sweep the chapter out from under Khorne's claws. With each battle brother that took communion from the chalice, more and more the chapter was converted, unwittingly, to the Plague God. Beyond my love for Blood Angels, I chose this path for my Death Guard army because it offers a lot of really cool conversion options. Nurgle already has a pretty strong aesthetic for insects and flies and other bugs, but with this I can really focus in on the tick/mosquito aspect of it. What I want to do with this spare Plague Marine body is to make that original sanguinary priest from my homebrew lore, the one who brought the Black Chalice to his chapter. The Death Guard equivalent is probably a Plague Surgeon, and while there is already a Plague Surgeon kit, it's kind of a tricky one to kitbash. So since I'd be building him from the ground up anyway, I might as well use this spare Plague Marine body to at least get a feel for how I want to go forward in my conversions. But let's start with our spare Plague Marine body. From what I've heard, you can actually cobble this guy together by collecting different Death Guard kits. Kinda like those Star Wars figures that came with R2-D2 parts back when I was a kid. I had a ton of those, but somehow never managed to assemble a full astromech droid, I don't think. But luckily for us, the regular Plague Marine kit, that also comes in this combat patrol, has a ton of extra bits for us to choose from, so that we don't have to cobble ours together. The main thing is finding another torso. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of these left over from your spare Plague Marines. I chose one of the ones with a bit of a distended belly. I like the idea of using this piece to kinda echo the distended stomach of a full mosquito or engorged tick. Now you'll notice here that these parts don't line up 100% correctly. Fixing this will take a little bit of work, but it's really the only big barrier to using these extra Plague Marine bits. The first thing is to carve away some of the extra bits that are getting in the way. This particular spare torso also has most of an arm attached to it, and some of the weird shoulder geometry is keeping our torso from lining up flush. So I just got to trimming that away with my side cutters. The angles around the neck don't quite line up either, so I trimmed that back as well. And make sure to snip down those little registration nubs while you're at it. Once that was done, I went ahead and removed the rest of the extra pauldron. If I had the rest of it, I'd be tempted to keep it, but right now it'll just get in the way of the rest of the build. Okay, but now back to the torso. The solution to our gaps here is simple: green stuff. Get used to it, we'll be using it a lot. All I do here is mix up a snake of putty and squish it along the seam of our 2 torso halves. That way, when I squish the 2 together, all I have to do is trim away the squeeze out and I've got a fairly flush-fitting torso. Just spend a little bit of time to blend in some of the details and we are good to go. To be entirely honest, you don't have to really worry about blending everything perfectly smoothly here. A lot of this will be covered, either by the arm joint or just by the arm itself later. But from here on out, most of these next steps are pretty much just cosmetic for my particular warband's aesthetic. If you're just going for a regular Plague Marine torso, you're pretty much good to go. You'll have to smooth the cape in a little bit, but we'll go over that later when we get to the green stuff work. But now let's get stuck into all the blood-sucking insectoid goodness that you're probably here for. First things first to the arm. I want this former sanguinary priest to be holding the Black Chalice, titular cup of goo of the Angels of the Black Chalice. The first and most obvious choice was the Sanguinor's Cup, left over from my last conversion video. This bit was fairly plug and play. The cape had to be trimmed a little bit, but I knew that was going to take some later cleanup anyway, so no big deal. Once the arm was on, I did make sure to give it some pockmarks to make sure it didn't look completely out of place. These were done with a pin vise first, before the holes were roughened up with an X-Acto blade. These will be highlighted later in the painting step, so you don't need to go too ham with the hobby knife. Next up was the head. I definitely wanted something insectoid, but that also still showed some Blood Angels echoes. The Plague Marine kit does come with this mosquito head that would be pretty much plug and play, but I wanted to see what I could make by hand first. I started with this head, because I think there's enough room to give him a big old proboscis while still showing the teeth off. First, I drilled a hole and glued in a paper clip. This doesn't need to be too long, but having something to hold our green stuff will really help in the long run. After that, it was just a matter of squishing some green stuff onto the paper clip and rolling it between my fingers until it came sharp enough to a point. You can either leave this straight and pointed, or give it a couple bends and kinks for a little bit more character. Afterwards, just make sure to blend it into the helmet a bit so it doesn't look too out of place. Now for a bit more Blood Angels iconography, I wanted to give this guy the big halo crown thing that you see on a lot of Blood Angels models. I took this one from a Warhammer-inspired helmet that I found on the Purple site. Carefully, I trimmed away the halo until it came away from the helmet, then with a bit of superglue, reattached it to the new helmet. I've done this on a few of my other Plague Marines already, and I think it looks really good. However, since I want this to eventually be a character model, I think it's a little bit too small right now. Luckily, I hadn't attached the helmet quite yet. I'll definitely be using it on a Plague Marine, don't get me wrong, it just wasn't quite the vibe I wanted for this character. Instead, I went back to the obvious, the mosquito-looking head from the base kit. I did still make a couple modifications, though. I really liked the look that the halo gave the old head, so I carefully removed it and replaced it on the new head. The mosquito head also has a little fleshy patch right above the right eye, where it looks like the armor has cracked and fallen away. I used this to my advantage, cutting a matching segment out of the halo to really drive the corruption theme home. Next up, I wanted to tackle the backpack. I still had a backpack from the old Sanguinary Guard kit, since I gave mine a jetpack. This, with all of its tubes and vials, would make for a really great starting point. Some things did still need to change, though. Firstly, the little attachments were carefully trimmed off and saved for later. I also trimmed off the apothecary symbol and later replaced it with some rust pockmarks. Then the reactor vents were carefully cut away. They looked a little too loyalist for the vibe I was going for. I replaced them with the vent arms from the backpack that's on the spare Poxwalker Plague Marine. Okay, now for a bit of an embarrassing misstep here. At this point, I wanted to try and give him a little butcher's apron thing, like the plastic Plague Surgeon kit. I even gave him this little chain bandolier to attach it to. However, filling gaps and sculpting for pelts made me massively overestimate my actual sculpting skills. I tried a few times to make it work, but it always just came out kind of lumpy and misshapen. Don't get me wrong, I'm not calling it quits on doing that type of sculpting work, I just think I need a little bit more practice before I take it to an actual miniature, and especially before I start doing tutorials on it. So instead, I dug into my bits bin and pulled out some bits to hang on the chain, since I still liked that inclusion. In particular, I liked mixing these severed heads from the Slaves to Darkness kit with the head from the Plague Marine kit that has a slurpy tube attached to it. It recontextualizes them not as just trophies, but as food? Fuel? A mid-battle snack? Either way, it's an easy bit of storytelling, and I dig it. Now there's one last big step here, but before I get into that, I want to take a moment to talk about kit bashing and conversion as a process. You've probably noticed a few inconsistencies in my footage. Arms disappearing, the backpack popping on and off, stuff like that. Part of that is the magic of editing, but another part of that is kit bashing, to me, isn't a straightforward process. In the process of converting and kit bashing a miniature, you're probably going to have moments where you think you're done with a part of the mini, or where you think you can move on to the next step before you really ought to. This time, it was the left arm and the backpack for me. I kept thinking I was done with the bits around these two parts, but then another step would come along and I'd have to yank them off to get where I need to be. But my point here is that's okay. Kit bashing is an iterative process, full of revision and redos. It's an art form in itself, not a science. While having an idea of a plan ahead of time is good, you'll probably have to revise it a ton along the way. You'll try new things, you'll fail at those new things, and you'll think it'll look like a mess the entire time. But again, that's normal. The kit bash process is an art in its own way, so let that process happen. It's really hard to irrevocably ruin a mini, and a project is only done when you say it's done. I don't know who said it first, but I've seen a saying floating around that there's no such thing as a badly painted mini, just a mini that you're not done with yet, and I really think that's a healthy approach to embody. And no, I promise I am not just saying that because of how many mistakes I made making this Plague Marine. But speaking of our little stanky lad, let's get back to him. Here's about where I ended day 1. After the apron incident, I knew something was missing, but I couldn't figure out what. So instead of just getting frustrated, I put it away for the day and came back the next morning with fresh eyes. And as is usually the case, the very next morning I looked at it and knew exactly what was missing. Big, ugly, insectoid wings. I hadn't really tried making wings before, but I had one method in mind to give it a shot. I picked up some thin plastic card from the hobby store, thick enough to hold its shape, but thin enough to still appear wing-like against the rest of the miniature. I cut out a couple of wing-like shapes, loosely based on mosquito wings, and sanded them into shape. After that, I wanted to give the wings some gross, veiny details. To do this, I just used some snakes of, you guessed it, green stuff. Once they were rolled out, I smushed them onto the wings roughly in the shape of how insect wing cells might look. For one last step, after I attached them onto the mini, I gave the edges some tears and gouges to bring them more in line with the general weathered vibe. Now this was my first time really trying this, and it did come out a little bit rough. However, I think it's still definitely a worthy addition to the army, and something that I'll definitely keep working on as I keep building my Death Guard. And speaking of, at this point I would really love to show you how I paint this guy, but I don't know myself yet. I've experimented a bit, and I think I've got the standard Death Guard green down pretty well, but I'm not going for standard Death Guard. I'm still trying to find a way to bring my own flair into the Death Guard color scheme while keeping it Death Guard. It's a tenuous balance that I don't think I've quite struck yet. So let me know if any of these halfway finished attempts stick out to you, and maybe I'll keep working on developing them into full paint recipes. But for now, let's give this stanky boy a black primer and a quick dry brush to show all of that detail we've worked so hard for. A lot of these techniques are definitely going to become staples in my Death Guard army, both on my infantry and on some of my vehicles. I've already done a few proboscises, and I'm getting the hang of compound eyes. I've also got a lot of ideas on how to push this buggy aesthetic even further. Adding the wings gave me a lot of ideas on different materials and surface textures that I can put onto my mini to really make it gross. I hope this video gave you some ideas on how to kitbash your own Death Guard minis, and I hope you stick around to see how I eventually paint this guy, once I figure out how I want to do that. Either way, drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a comment to tell me what you think, subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all of my stinky Space Marines, and until next time, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.